Everyone, oops, it's on. I'm so sorry. If you weren't awake, you are now. I'm sorry. My name is Lisa Perhamus. It is so wonderful to see so many people here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's good to see you all. We have over 100 people joining us virtually this evening as well. So we have a nice turnout for an important conversation. So thank you to everyone. I'd like to give a special thank you and welcome also to President Mantella, Interim Provost Pluff, members of the Board of the Trustees, Dean Schaub, Hauenstein Center members, and our community members who have joined us here this evening. We are gathered during an intense historical moment. There is much happening in the world right now that evidences how social, cultural, and political differences can become toxic, polarizing, and destructive. I appreciate the opportunity we have tonight to consider how we can use dialogue to bridge some of these divisions. While civil discourse can't stop a war, it can help us to stop demonizing each other. And this strikes me as an incredibly powerful beginning step toward peace. So what is civil discourse? Purposeful dialogue across difference to increase shared understanding around a social issue. The social issue we are collectively examining tonight is racism, and we hope that our dialogue here this evening will increase a shared understanding about the ways we can relate to one another with radical empathy. This symposium is an opportunity for us to listen and talk with one another across multiple perspectives about the very human impact of racism in ways that honor each person's particular lived experience, with a focus on hope and action. I'd like us all to pause for a moment and reflect upon how civil discourse and the idea of civility have historically been used at times to tone police one another, to hold each other to a standard of proper, normal, and socially appropriate. At issue here is the fact that what is socially appropriate is culturally shaped. It means different things to different people with different things at stake. Who decides what is proper? Who defines socially appropriate? And yet, without some sort of common understanding of what is socially acceptable, how can we, as a country, as a collective, work and talk across the proverbial aisle? How can we relate to each other with civility without tone policing each other? And how can we use the tools of civil discourse in ways that elevate and honor the incredible diversity among us? These questions challenge us to consider the role of civil discourse in societal relationships of power as we consider who is doing the defining and who is being defined. To be clear, the PannoSerosa Center for Civil Discourse is committed to advancing principles of civil discourse that empower people to speak their truth and support people to listen across difference in ways that resist defining each other in the process, in ways that honor each other's personhood. I invite us to explore these ideas this evening as we listen and learn from both the expertise of Dr. Givens and the wisdom of each other. To help us keep our dialogue tonight constructive and to help us ensure that we are using the tools of civil discourse in empowering ways, I offer the civil discourse strategy of establishing group agreements or conversation guidelines. Conversation guidelines help us create the dialogic conditions for relating to each other across divergent standpoints and perspectives. You can see them on the screens around, and you also have them printed in your program. So the conversation, first one is, let's assume positive intention of one another. If we can, let's try not to assume anything and ask a clarifying question, but if we are assuming, let's assume positive intent. Let's listen to understand, to really hear one another. When we speak, let's use I statements and speak from our own experience. Let's share the talking space, offer each other grace, and grow the conversation by building on what others have shared. Let's all keep these dialogues in mind tonight as we converse with one another. I'd like to end with a quote from Margaret Wheatley, and she says, "Everyone has something to teach me. This is hard to keep in mind in the face of disagreement. But if we can remain curious about each other, we can learn from each other. And when we learn from one another, we break down social barriers and open up possibilities for human connection. I'm looking forward to the connections we will make with each other this evening." And now I am honored to introduce to you the president of Grand Valley State University, President Mantella.
Thank you, Lisa. And Lisa has been a driving force behind the center. So I would like to, where did she go? There you are. Okay. I looked for you at the table and didn't see you. Let's give her a round of applause for her literally relentless work in this space. And I really would like to recognize Carol, who's here, and Shelley, who is not with us, but I know is with us in spirit, for their generous gift that enable us to catalyze this activity. And there are so many people in the room. And one of the wonderful things that I enjoy about Grand Valley State University is notions like civil discourse they permeate our university spirit. They permeate student life. Melissa is here and she's taken a leadership role. They permeate our academic space. We have Dr. Jeffrey Lowenstein, who's working on new curricular areas, not only in the topics, but a 1 credit opportunity to fit within any curriculum in Grand Valley. Jennifer, you spoke at our last fireside chat around equity in the curriculum and the themes of difference and discourse. And so many people bring this to the table here in our community broadly. And I'm just privileged and happy to be a part of it. I'm looking forward to our speaker. Thank you for being with us today and to the program. So with that, thank you for being at Grand Valley, and thank you to those in the room who lead this very important effort for us to speak across difference, to speak with humility and honor of each other's lived experience. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to watch a video. How about that? My official words say, "Thank you, President Mantella," which I'm excited to now share with you a video that speaks to the tradition we are building at the PannoSerosa Center for Civil Discourse. So some of you know this already, and for some of you, this is new. We were first established in 2013 through the generosity of Shelley Padnos and Carol Sorosic. Where's Carol? Carol is here this evening. Thank you, Carol. We have expanded, and we were launched as a center this past August. Tonight's symposium is, in part, a celebration of our growth and development as a center, and we thank you for joining us. I'd like to give a special thank you to Bill Cuppy and University Communications for the production of this video, the Brooks College Dean's Office for the support to make its production possible, and I'd like to give a special thank you to Professor Jeff Kelly Lowenstein for his help with creating the narrative arc of this video.
You're creating the view.
Civil discourse is engaged, purposeful conversation or dialogue, usually around solving a social problem or something that's for the common good. It is about remembering that the other person has something to teach you and that everyone has a right to be understood.
Shelley and Carol came to GVSU, said, let's be partners in trying to do something, doing something positive that involves students. We want to make a difference for the West Michigan community, but we want to make a real difference for society in general.
We'd both visited the Anne Frank house before, but when we left the house, we both looked at each other and said, we really needed to think about whether there was something that we could do to help not have things like that happen again.
The divisions that we have among us and between us as Americans and as global citizens is problematic.
The whole idea is really
to contribute to a better citizenry, to contribute to a better community, committed to these values of respect and understanding.
My very first class was called Learning from Detroit.
We traveled to Detroit to speak with community members, learn from them. That class meant everything to me in terms of learning the skills of civil discourse. And then when I moved on, I used all of the skills that I learned in the course in my daily life and in how I presented myself as a potential graduate student.
To hear the students talk about the changes in their life as a result of the class has been extraordinarily rewarding.
The students are very hungry for respectful and vigorous discussion on key issues that they're experiencing. We talked about COVID mandates, issues that are happening in the country, and issues that are happening in the world.
The civil discourse class helped me realize that there is actually a process here to know how to dialogue in a meaningful way.
As students leave GVSU, they will be leaders in their own ways to impact the world and to really make sure that we can still talk to each other respectfully.
They see that this is a big need for the country, for the world, for West Michigan, and they've done something about it.
And now we're actually, in fact, a center and a growing presence within Grand Valley and then in national and even international conversations. That's a very exciting process to be a part of.
We're lucky enough to have kids who are interested in growing. We're giving them the opportunity to do that. And I think that it's really naive to think that there isn't almost anybody out there who couldn't benefit from this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Perhamus, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here in person, as well as everybody who is here online. This is a big day for our center and our community here at Grand Valley State University. One of my major goals since becoming PannoSerosa Professor in late 2019 has been to build on the tradition that we've created to help us become a national and international leader on the critical area of civil discourse, an issue that has only become more important during that time. We are still early in that journey, and I will say that there's no better person to be here with us on this important occasion than Dr. Terri Givens. She's an acclaimed political scientist whose work focused early on radical right-wing parties in Europe. She's a risk taker, a brave adventurer whose career has seen her be a professor, provost, educational entrepreneur, and now the academic lead and advisor on the action plan to address anti-Black racism at McGill University in Canada. She is also the author of the book that will form the basis of today's presentation and conversation. In Radical Empathy, Finding a Path to Bridging Racial Divides, Dr. Givens lays out a 6-point method to engage first in vulnerable sharing and deep listening, and from there to work with others to enact fundamental change. And I want to thank Dr. Givens on a personal note because of her contributions to my own development. She and I were classmates at Stanford in the 1980s. While we learned recently that we had some common friends, we did not know each other at that time. But reading her description in the book of some of the same experiences we had, like freshman orientation, reminded me in a powerful way of the levels of privilege I unconsciously absorbed at the time and have worked in the decades since then to be more conscious of and engaged in doing something about. Here is our plan for the evening. Dr. Givens will talk for 25 minutes. She'll field questions from Tiara Sheets and Zach Perangeli, two of our terrific students from last semester's Civil Discourse class, and then from folks here in the room and online. So for folks who are online, if you have questions, please put them in the chat to Grace and Allie in the back from the Hauenstein Center, who were thrilled are our partners in this virtual part of the presentation. From there, we'll break into table level discussions in person here and breakout rooms online. Could our facilitators please raise their hands? Yes, thank you, facilitators. Thank you for your time and contributions to our community. I will circulate the room to give a 5-minute warning. We will then come back together to hear what we discussed. And I want to be clear that we are adopting this structure to increase the time and depth of exchange that Professor Perhamus discussed and the range of opinions compared with what we've had at some previous symposia. So now please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Terri Givens.
Class of 87. I think one of us looks a little better. Anyway, thanks so much for having me. This is really a pleasure. I am so excited to be here. And actually, there's a few faces I know, like a little more over there, and a couple of folks I follow on Twitter and so on. I'm very much into social media, and I hope you guys are all tweeting right now about this. But in any case, and by the way, I saw a copy of my book behind the deans, but this is the new paperback version. So it's changed a little bit with the cover, but still the same book. So I wanted to start off, first of all, by saying, Shelley and Carol, you guys are totally exemplify what radical empathy is all about. Going to the Anne Frank House is designed to help you develop empathy and to want to take action. And that's what radical empathy is all about. And I also just want to say that I really appreciate being at an institution that is so oriented towards its students. I was having a discussion earlier today about the fact that we need to be student-centered entities, that our higher education needs to really focus in on student success. And I think this is a great institution from that perspective. So in any case, let's go ahead. I have just a couple of slides to share with you today. So we can go ahead and do the first one. And so if you have heard anything about the book, it's really about storytelling. And so there's the component of storytelling on one hand, but also, I bring in my perspective as a political scientist with data. But tonight I'm going to start off with some storytelling because I am the youngest of 7 children. I was actually, the subtitle of the book was going to be Growing Up Black and Catholic in Spokane, Washington, but I went with something different. So my dad was in the military, and that's 1964. I'm the baby in my mom's arms. And I have 4 sisters and 2 brothers. My mother was very Catholic. She was born and raised in, she was born in Opelousas, Louisiana, later lived in New Orleans. And she was part of the Great Migration. She moved from New Orleans to Los Angeles in the early 1950s. My dad's father was part of the Great Migration. He went from Georgia to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I did start out as a Steelers fan, then went to the Seahawks. And so my family is very into sports. Actually, if you saw me on my phone earlier, it's because my son is running track and he had an injury and I had to talk to him very quickly. But in any case, you can see I ran track as well at Stanford. But so my dad was in the military, and actually my 2 older siblings, Marcia and Rhonda there on the end, were born in Los Angeles. My next 2 siblings were born in England. My dad was part of, in the Air Force, he was in part of Strategic Air Command. And so he would, Los Angeles is one of the places where they had radar and so on. And then Ruislip, England, and then back to Los Angeles, where my brother Roy was born. And then my brother Craig was born in Shreveport, which is actually where my dad did his NCO class. And I call the picture on the far side there, one of these things is not like the other picture. And obviously my dad is the only African-American in that picture. And I didn't discover this picture until a few years ago. He passed away in 2001. And the picture just reminded me so much of what it's like to be kind of one of the first, to be out there. And I could experience many times in my own life, especially being a leader in higher ed, where I was the only woman or the only Black person or the only Black woman in the room. We're watching this happening now with our next Supreme Court justice. But in any case, it really struck me seeing that picture. And my dad always told us, they call it an African-American proverb, you have to work twice as hard to get half the credit. And something he always impressed on us was that idea that we always had to be, dressed, we'd go to church, we had to be dressed properly. I mean, people were just amazed that my mom could have these 7 kids all dressed properly and staying quiet and being behaved. And, all those things were really important, for there's kind of the whole respectability politics that goes around being African American in this country. And so growing up in Spokane, for those who don't know, it's the 1964 especially, it was less than 1% Black. And on top of that, we were Catholic, so we did not interact with a lot of other Black families, except some of the families that my parents knew from the military. And so a lot of the time I spent growing up was in, predominantly white spaces. And my parents also didn't have a lot of Black friends. And so, and a lot of the Black population in Spokane went to the Baptist church, and we didn't go to the Baptist church. So we didn't have a lot of interaction with a lot of other Black families and so on. So, I really felt this kind of distance. And in many ways, I resented the fact that we grew up in Spokane because, why didn't we go back to Los Angeles or, somewhere else? And if you think about the 1960s, my dad retired from the military in the early 70s, but, late 60s, early 70s, Los Angeles, especially where my parents had lived, South Central LA, when they were there in the 50s, it was great as middle class. It really declined a lot by the time the late 60s, early 70s came around. And so, I can say it's taken me a lot of time to understand, the choices they made. And one of the books that really helped me a lot was Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. And when I thought about the fact, my mom, went from New Orleans to Los Angeles to seek a better life. She worked as a seamstress. She met my dad there, and my dad's father had left, Georgia to go to Pittsburgh. I mean, one of the things I realized from that book, my grandfather when he was in Opelousas was a sharecropper, and my grandfather from Georgia was a sharecropper, and I'm their wildest dream. And my parents made choices designed to put their children in a position to be able to have a better education, to have better access to jobs and so on. So it was really important for me to understand why they made the choices they did. Spokane was a place that they felt was safe, and that where they could raise a family, and frankly, Spokane was great growing up. I tell people it's like growing up in Mayberry RFD. You could ride your bikes everywhere, and we stayed out all night, not all night, all evening until Mom called us in. And my dad loved camping. We would go camping almost every weekend in the summer, and we'd play in the lake. And so, I thought great, but on the other side, culturally and so on, there were some issues with growing up in Spokane. And so when I got to college at Stanford, first generation, I was the first in my family to actually finish college. There were a lot of cultural issues to deal with, like Jeff was alluding to. And one of the first things I experienced was freshman orientation, where they had a separate Black freshman orientation and the regular one. And, they were at the same time. And I was like, wait a second, you guys are making me make a choice between these two events. And it's like, well, I want to meet the people in my dorm, because those are the people I'm going to be hanging out with the most. And so, but I felt really conflicted in having to make that kind of a choice. And so in the end, I stayed and hung out with my dorm mates, and, there were other Black students in my dorm, and we connected as well. But it was just, one of those situations where it felt uncomfortable, really. And in any case, the picture of me running track at Stanford is kind of gratuitous. I've thrown that one in ever since the Olympics, because it's like, yeah, I ran track at Stanford. And my favorite track story is I got to compete against Jackie Joyner-Kersee when she was at UCLA. She was way, 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 way better than I was. Don't think that I was good, but I was not anywhere near. Basically, it was Jackie Joyner-Kersee against the entire Stanford track team. And we had some Olympians on that track team, don't get me wrong, but Jackie Joyner beat the entire team. So in any case, so to come back to, the whole family issue, one of the things that happened that I start out the book with, actually, was that really got me going on writing this book, was the passing of my father in 2001. And he died of a heart attack. And, it was the first family member that I lost, a very close family member. And, after I kind of got through my grief, I started looking at, what were the risk factors did he have? And I learned that just being an African-American male makes you more likely to have a heart attack, to die from a first heart attack, and so on. And I was just kind of shocked by that. In 2001, I was just at the start of my academic career. Things were going great. I was like, this is so wonderful. I really have, come a long way. And, in a sense, I knew, because I was kind of in, especially from a leadership position, I knew I was always going to be in a lot of white spaces. So you always have this expectation, every time you walk into a white space, okay, I have to remember that people won't know who I am, or they might think I'm part of the help, or, so I always was very, you have to dress a certain way, you have to talk a certain way, you have to make sure you introduce yourself and people know that you're a professor. And I remember I was at University of Washington to start out with, and I remember walking into the classroom and, making sure, because I'm teaching Western European politics. And I'm like, I'm sure these kids don't expect a Black woman to walk into the room and be teaching Western European politics, but that was my field. So I would always make sure, I dressed a certain way and would introduce myself right away and make sure they knew, yes, I am the teacher for this class. So, but those were things I took for granted, right? I didn't, it's like, okay, well, I'm a Black woman and there aren't very many Black women, and especially in political science and studying the radical right in Europe and so on. So I really just kind of assumed that this is just the way things are. And over time, I realized, well, wait a second, is this really the way things should be? And, I had several other family members dealing with health issues, and later on, in more recent years, there's been a lot of publicity about the fact that African American women, regardless of education level or social class, are more likely to have poor maternal and fetal health outcomes. We've seen what's happened with COVID, all these things, and so all these things really built up over time. In my own work on race and immigration politics in Europe also played a role in my understanding about these issues. And so I realized one of the first things I really had to do was take a look at my own life and understand. I really wanted to understand why my parents made the choices they did. And like I said, there were several books that really helped me to understand, that generation and the choices they made and the way they approached things. And so, Isabel Wilkerson's book was one, and another book that I thought was really helpful in that regard was Yagisi's book, Homegoing, because it was the first book I read that really helped me to gain a perspective on, the African side of what happened with the slave trade, and, kind of how these one family growing up in, having it being in the America and one in Africa, and eventually connecting in the present day. And that really gave me some insight and perspective in terms of how history impacted our families more broadly. And so in any case, let's go ahead and jump into the next slide, which will talk more in detail about what radical empathy is. And the first thing I talk about is identity, and not the way even political scientists talk about it, but it's more, what is our identity? And often when I do these kinds of workshops, I'll have people do an identity map. And the reason I have people do that is because we have to understand that we're complicated people. We aren't just one thing. I'm an athlete, I'm a mother, I'm a sister, I love science fiction, and which reminds me, Aubrey, I have to talk about the science fiction component. I love so many different things. I love being in the outdoors. I love camping. I love going to national parks. There's all these things, and that's the way we can connect with people, right? Is if we think about people as being multifaceted and not just one thing, not just a Republican or not just a Democrat or not just any one thing. We have so many facets to our personality. And then a second component is storytelling. And it's really important. I mean, I read a lot about empathy, and if I'm on LinkedIn all the time, and people are talking about leadership and empathy. And empathy is really becoming, the thing. But empathy has always been important, and it's partly storytelling that helps us to not only develop empathy for others, but for ourselves. And that's why I think being able to tell our own stories in terms of our family stories and life experiences is so much a part of what, and I'm just keeping my eye on the time. But the reason I went to empathy is because you saw the picture of me as a kid. So in 1964, I was just born, but my father and all my siblings really loved Star Trek. So I grew up watching Star Trek, and one of my most favorite episodes is about Jem, who is an empath, and Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are transported to this strange place, and they meet this woman, and they realize she's an empath. Not only can she understand what other people feel, she actually takes on their injuries and can make them go away. And I was always fascinated by that story. I really wanted to be an empath. And so when I was thinking about, how I wanted to deal with, these various issues of race and gender and all these different things that we deal with in our lives, I was like, well, what's important is just being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And I have to say, growing up Catholic also played a very important role in my understanding, because I understood that, you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But I always take that the next step is you should do that's the golden rule, that you want the platinum rule, which is do unto others as they would have you do unto them, right? Maybe the way I want things done is very different from what somebody else wants. And so actually being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and understand their needs, even as a professor, that's really important for us when we're teaching, when we're working with our students, and so on. So I developed the 6 steps to radical empathy as I was kind of thinking through my own path to, in some ways understanding the choices my parents made in life, understanding the things I experienced throughout my career. But the first step I realized was a willingness to be vulnerable. And the reason willingness to be vulnerable is important is because it's really looking inside and saying, what are some of the things that have impacted me? And, I realized, I had bias. I mean, I had to admit to myself that the fact that, my parents often were very judgmental and looked down on other people, in many ways, I internalized that. And I talk about internalized oppression. And so for me, it was really important to understand that all of us are living in a world that is defined by things like structural discrimination, right? We internalize it. We just, like I said, back when I was early in my career, I just assumed, okay, people are going to say things, or, they're going to see me walk into a room. It's just, you just internalize, and that's like, hey, this is normal. And the reality is it's not. We should all be treated in the way we would like, with respect and so on. And so that willingness to be vulnerable, however, was really important to me to understand the ways that I was perpetuating these stereotypes and so on. I don't want people sitting there putting me into a box. So why is it that I'm then turning around and putting people into a box myself? And it's a struggle, I can tell you. And that willingness to be vulnerable is not easy. And I tell people, people might use my vulnerability against me. It's like, it's not about being vulnerable necessarily with others. In this book, I'm vulnerable all over the place. I can tell you that. And there were times it was really hard for me, but I knew how important this issue is today. And that it was important for me to get out there, to be vulnerable, to model what it means to be vulnerable. And so that first step was the hardest, but probably the most important. And then the next step was becoming grounded in who you are. And I always say I spent my 20s with my 20s were my years of cognitive dissonance, because I felt like, I'm sure many of us experienced this in our teens and 20s, but, for me, I felt like I had this tape running in my head of, well, you're Black, so you should act this way, but wait, you grew up in Spokane, so you should act that way. And you need to do this, you need to do that. There was all of these things that just were constantly running in my head that I need to be doing. And I finally said, wait a second, just be who you are. I feel like I got to my late 20s, and, my current husband, and I were the only husband, and I were dating, and we fell in love because, we love who each other is. And I thought, wow, and I really think I talk about this in the book because I think it's really important to understand, if you want somebody to love you, you have to love yourself first. So becoming grounded in who you are, that's my Whitney Houston moment of the greatest love of all is learning to love yourself. And, I had a hard time with that at first. But once I realized that, I'm a child of God and that I am loved, and, there are people out there who really care about me and who I am, not the person I think I should be, that was really helpful in my process to really becoming grounded in who I am. And not only just, learning to love myself, but really understanding what made me tick. What were the things that were important to me? And so the next step is then opening yourself to the experiences of others. And I really believe it's really important to love yourself before you can love somebody else. And, when my nieces and nephews and so on come to me and want, relationship advice, that's what I tell them. First of all, you need to learn to love yourself before you can really love somebody else. And secondly, you really want to be with somebody who makes you better than you. Basically the two of you together the sum is greater than the whole. Anyway, I can't get that quote right, but you know what I mean. So then the next step is practicing empathy. Empathy does not come easily at times. There have been plenty of times when I've just had to stop and take a deep breath. Okay, I'm going to practice empathy. And actually, my latest thing is, since I were just really starting to fly again, when I got on my flight here from San Francisco, I just stopped and said, I really appreciate you flight attendants, because you guys have been dealing with a lot of crap. And I just hope you realize that there's so many of us who appreciate you and that you're keeping us safe in the air. And, because you hear all these stories about, the flight attendants being attacked and so on, and it's just awful. So, I really try to practice empathy in various ways. Like, God, what would it be like to be a flight attendant and, being worried that people aren't going to wear their masks, and especially now, and all this stuff. So practicing empathy is a daily process. And then taking action is the next one. And because that's the radical part of it, because you can have empathy, but if you aren't taking action, then it really means that you aren't, it's just not going out into the world and, actually, creating change. And, the last step is creating change and building trust. And so, these 6 steps are something I worked through as I was developing the book. And I really think it's become an important component of how we see the world, and realize the reason that it's circular is because it's an iterative process. It's a never ending process. It's something that it's not, you start from 1 and get to 6 and you're done. It's ongoing. And, the really important thing that I appreciate from this broader discussion is that, it does come back to this idea of civil discourse. I talk about bridging racial divides, but it's about bridging any kind of divide, because we all have different divides that we're dealing with. You can talk about intersectionality and all the different ways we can interact with each other, but we have so many different divides in our society. And I really think the ideas behind civil discourse and radical empathy, and it's interesting. I saw the guidelines for discussion. I use almost the same exact guidelines when I do workshops and so on, because, those are so important. And really understanding where we are coming from, and, doing things like using I statements and so on, is really trying to create what I call a brave and safe space. And one of the most important things I often talk about is, that there's that component of giving grace, but it's giving people grace to learn. Right. One of the examples I use in my own class was when Whoopi Goldberg, said what she said about Jews and race and so on. And I said, look, this is a teaching moment, right? Here's somebody who made a mistake, basically, and, apologized. And it's an opportunity for somebody who maybe didn't understand something very well. And we need to let people do that, right? If somebody says something or does something that, as long as they're sincere, you want to say, oh, wait a second, let me explain why what you said isn't exactly right. And here's my perspective on this. And so I actually started off my class with the kind of these guidelines. And not only did we start off with the guidelines, I said, we're going to create our own, actually the first class is always an intro, but the second class, we sat down and I said, okay, actually we were still remote at that point. So I broke them into Zoom rooms, and I had them come up with, what their top 3 components of having civil dialogue was about, right? Basically, I didn't call it that, but that's what I'll call it going forward. And so letting the students have some agency, because another component of this is giving people agency, right? And giving our students agency to help us develop how we're going to conduct the class and what they think is respectful dialogue. I think is another important component. So I'm really a firm believer in modeling what radical empathy is about, but also giving students the opportunity to practice it in various ways. So that's been another component. And I'm coming up on my time, but I'll tell one last story, which is about a year. So I was the provost at Menlo College, and basically had decided to leave academia in 2018. I'd been thinking about it since about 2010 for various reasons. If you read the book, you'll know why. But in any case, I thought my academic career was at an end, and I was doing a lot, and I'm still doing a lot of work. And part of the reason I'm here is because I'm doing a lot of work around radical empathy and promoting the book, but also really trying to promote dialogue in various communities and working with corporations and so on. And but about a year ago, I was talking to the folks at McGill, and I realized that they were actually we talk about innovation. I mean, I really thought they were taking a really interesting approach to dealing with the fact that basically 3 years ago they had 8 Black faculty out of 1,700, and they after the George Floyd murder and so on, they decided that it's time for a change. And so they created a strategy to address anti-Black racism, which was very much focused on things like hiring Black faculty, bringing in more Black students, opening up their programming in ways, starting a Black Studies program, all these things, which, they were way behind compared to many other institutions. And so, what drew me back was partly that opportunity to do something kind of new and innovative that was going to really change the institution. Because I believe if you can create this kind of change at an institution like McGill, you can do it anywhere. So no other university has an excuse to say they can't do it. But the other side of it is they were very open to the radical empathy approach. And I've worked with the upper level administration. I gave workshops to the deans and the provosts and the vice provosts, and the provost has really said this has really made a difference, because you can't just say we're going to hire Black faculty and students. You have to change the culture, because when you have a place that has been the way it is for 200, it's basically they just had their bicentennial, 200 years, changing the culture really takes a method like radical empathy for people to understand, why is it that Black students don't want to come to McGill? Well, it's because they don't see anybody who looks like them. I had so many students come up to me and say, you're the first Black professor I've had in my entire time at McGill, and it's not surprising. So in any case, that's why I'm at McGill today. Actually, I'll be getting there again on Friday, but I'll stop there and open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Givens, for those informative, thought-provoking, and inspiring words. I appreciate Dr. Givens mentioning Aubrey. We are a team at the PannoSerosa Civil Discourse Center, so I just want to make sure we acknowledge Aubrey Dull, Sam Johnson, and Maddie Miller, who have worked extremely hard to make this event possible. Can we please acknowledge them? So we will now hear from 2 students in the Civil Discourse class that read Dr. Givens's work and dialogued with her remotely last semester. The first student is Tiara Sheets, and the second student is Zach Perangeli. Tiara is joined by her mother. We're very glad you're here. The students have formulated their own questions, and we asked them to participate in this event precisely because they bring different experiences and perspectives to Dr. Givens's work and the issues she raises. So we're hoping that these different perspectives in the questions from Tiara and Zach will then foreshadow and stimulate different perspectives and dialogue within the group discussions and then online as well. So Tiara, the floor is yours.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Tiara Sheets and I'm a social work student here at Grand Valley State University. I was first introduced last semester to Dr. Terri Givens, her book and her mission to bridge divides with radical empathy. I'm honored to be part of such a huge topic that I feel every human and quite frankly our world needs. To me, radical empathy is about learning where our biases come from, our triggers, our way of thinking, and our hate. If you can take a step back and truly look at where your prejudice comes from there you can begin to make change within yourself and real change within society. So I have a special love of systematic oppression, systematic racism, systematic sexism, classism, and so on. So my question to Dr. Givens is, how do you take the idea of radical empathy and apply it on a macro level? How do we use this concept to rebuild our oppressive systems? And what would you say the biggest strategy or mindset someone would need to have to use radical empathy in policy or advocacy?
That's a great question, and I get that question often. It's putting radical empathy into practice, basically. And so, for me, part of the reason I start with at the individual level is because we've done kind of the systemic stuff. We have laws, we have different things in place, and yet certain ways of discrimination still persist. And so I really believe that it takes each of us to look inside and to say, okay, what can I do? What do I not like about what I'm seeing out there? And that's why actually every chapter of the book ends with actions you can take. And that's what it is really about. Now, from the systemic level, I think it's important to think about, our political systems. But, I always tell people, we tend to focus at the national level. Really, what's happening to a certain extent is in our communities, which is I'm between McGill and where I live in California. Actually, I started working with the school district and the city of Menlo Park. And actually, after I leave here tonight, I'm going to help facilitate a community discussion, which will be at 6 o'clock California time and 9 o'clock here. So I'm going straight from here to yet another facilitation. But part of the reason I'm engaged there is because you think about policing. I one of the first things I did when we got a new police chief is I invited him to coffee, and I said, hey, let's sit down, let's talk. He's very interested in hearing from the community, and he's actually these dialogues we're having in Menlo Park are about policing specifically, and hearing from so that part of it is how do we create a dialogue in our community to talk about these issues? And to be fair, policing in Menlo Park isn't a huge problem. It's a city of 30,000 people, and town, I should say. And we don't have a lot of crime. It's mostly property crime and so on. But still, people, when they see what's happening at the national level, they want to understand, okay, what's happening in the police department. So that's one example of, I try to connect with, I'm on a lot of boards, for nonprofits that are doing, work in the community. So for me, it's about connecting with the local community. And even in Montreal, our part of our group in the anti-Black racism strategy is reaching out to Black communities in Montreal to let them know, they're welcome to come to McGill, whether it's, to send their kids or to come and participate in the events we have. And so part of it is that, it's not just about, okay, we're going to bring all these people in. It's about reaching out to the community and letting them know they're welcome. So that's, there's so many different things you can do from that perspective. And if you think about, it's like, a drop in the water, it spreads out, and, you think one person can't do anything, but, each of us is a drop in the water that can spread out and impact so many other people. So that's where I see the systemic change really happening, is that we have to go in and really be willing to work on it individually. Zach, you want to?
Hello, everybody. I'm Zach. I'm studying chemistry here at Grand Valley, so I was involved through the civil discourse class as more of an elective than part of a potential program. But Dr. Givens, I have read your book and discussed its contexts with my fellow classmates. I appreciate your ability to be vulnerable in your experiences, as well as believe that vulnerability and openness to understanding are key in civil dialogue. I'm glad that you are able to take the time to meet with our class via Zoom last semester, where I asked you a question similar to the one I'm going to ask you today. Despite having read your work, I have a difficult time believing in the concept of institutional racism and its structural oppression of minority communities. I also have a difficult time believing that I benefit from white privilege or that white supremacy is an existential threat to our society. In an increasingly fragmented America, how do you encourage exposing those like me to the idea of the existence of a systemic oppression and inherent privilege without alienating individuals for simply not agreeing with issues that are prevalent in America today?
And again, a really great question and really important to our understanding of, the broader issues. And, as Jeff mentioned, I started out my career studying the radical right in Europe. And one of the things I learned is that, part of the broader issues we have to put in the broader context, right? So these issues of structural discrimination and so on are part of a broader context of things like inequality. And so I know for a fact there are people in Europe and in the United States who are doing worse off now than they were when, if you look at the 50s and 60s and so on. We've lost, this city is about that, right? We don't have the furniture manufacturing here like we used to. You used to be able to go to high school and get a really great job working in the auto industry and so on. So one of the things I think is important for those of us who may have, believe structural racism exists is to understand that there are other isms out there that people are experiencing that, it's like, it's really hard to understand why, if you're a white person and you're, don't have access to the kinds of jobs that you used to have and so on, that it's like you think I don't have white privilege, of course, but the reality is it's thinking about it in terms of broader conceptual ways. And the way I think about it is that that's why I really focus in on the history. That doesn't mean that people aren't hurting. And that I also have to have empathy and understand that there are people out there who are hurting and who don't understand why I might want to talk about white supremacy or injustice for African Americans. But that's my experience, right? And so I have to understand that I'm focusing in on my experience, but I also have to focus in on the experience of others and understand why they may not feel the same way that I do. And so I think it's really critical that we put things in the broader context, right? And say, yes, it's just not the prospects for our young people just aren't the same as they were. And we're all dealing with this broader society where inequality has just exploded. And so from that perspective, I try to, again, put myself in the shoes of somebody who is having those experiences and say, look, I have to have some, there's empathy, but there's also compassion. There's also trying to have, dialogue and understanding. And so, the reason I use my own stories is because I read a ton and I look at the fact that, I'm privileged, right? I have a great life. I have a husband who's an engineer, I went to Stanford, for God's sake. It doesn't get more privileged than that. So, of course, we are full of ourselves coming from Stanford, but anyway, but understanding that I have privilege, right, in a way that others don't, helps me to understand why, somebody might not understand why I think that they have privilege when they see that my life is so. That's why I tell my stories, right? It's about telling stories and hearing other people's stories and understanding why it is that they may not be having the same understanding that I do. So that's why, to me, it's about telling each other our stories. It's about trying to understand different people's perspectives, and you may not believe me that these things are important, and that's okay, right? We have to also be willing to accept that people aren't always going to, come to the same conclusion that we do. And one of the things, I'm glad you raised this point because I forgot to mention one of the more important things I always say, which is empathy is not absolution. So I may have empathy for you, but that doesn't mean I'm going to agree with you. So, and that we are I mean, of course, we're going to have differences and differences in the way we approach things. And just because I believe something strongly doesn't mean, and I'm going to do my best to convince you, but I may not be able to convince you. And so, I always keep that in mind, that, I respect you for, and that's the important thing, right? Is that if you are willing to give me the time to listen, and I'm willing to give you the time and listen to you, that at the minimum, we can respect each other and understand that, we all have things that we are dealing with in this life, and, understanding the different ways that privilege works, which is important to keep in mind. We have a very structured society. Even, I think about higher ed and, the ways we, the Ivy League and all that. And I could tell many more stories from that perspective, but thanks. I really appreciate your question, Zach. So.
Thank you very much, Dr. Givens. And I wanted to acknowledge both Tierra and Zach. They actually sat in the same row in the class. Zach was right at the front and Tierra was in the back, and there were about 8 social work students. So we called it the social work corner. And on the first day of class, Zach talked. Zach is a member of Turning Point. He's an officer. And he talked very openly about some of the challenges he and other politically conservative students have had on campus in having an open dialogue. And so I really admired how all the students together, we created a community where people did feel comfortable having very different opinions, but sharing that. So can we please acknowledge our 2 students? Thank you very much. So what I wanted to do now was is to turn over to Q&A. We have about 10 minutes. So if there's any questions in the room, and then I didn't know if there's any questions in the chat. So why don't maybe we can start with one in the room and then one in the chat and see where we are, and then we'll move to the table level portion. So, and Mr. Holmes can circulate to give the microphone. So would somebody have, okay, another microphone over here. So did somebody have a question in the room that they wanted to ask? Yes, in the back, please. Yes, thank you so much. And can you just stand and say your name, please?
Is this on?
Yes.
Now it is. Kristen Evans, I'm with the Division of Student Affairs and Housing. Another initiative that's taking root at Grand Valley and bubbling up is restorative practices. So I'm curious in your work how you see radical empathy overlaying, intersecting, and complementing restorative practices and restorative justice.
Well, that's the last chapter. So one of the things that I did in the process of preparing to write this book is I got to go to, well, I'd already spent a lot of time in Germany. And so I really was trying to understand how, actually going back to when I was a grad student, the first time I went to Germany and spent significant time, I was actually learning German, and I was staying in a dorm on the University of Konstanz campus. And so my dorm mates were German, and we talked a lot about how they were educated to understand the Holocaust, and that they should speak up and shouldn't let authority keep them from speaking up, and so on. And so that was really interesting to me. And then later on, and I'm going to forget the names of the authors, but there's a book called Learning from the Germans that I read that was really interesting, and it brought together perspectives from the U.S., South Africa, and Germany on kind of more restorative practices. And then going to South Africa, I went to South Africa in 2016, and got to see a lot of the areas, Nelson Mandela's work and Johannesburg, and just kind of learning more about the country. And and none of these processes are, one of the things you have to understand is these processes aren't perfect, right? Many of them, have made some progress, but, haven't, you can see it in South Africa, right? That the process has not, even though people were open about, what happened and so on, it really hasn't led to a true restorative process. And, in Germany, I think they got a little farther, but there's still, as I do and see in my research, there's still a lot of issues there. And so I think, from my perspective, I'm kind of looking at it from a more global perspective, that I think there, and actually now being in Canada, and the restorative justice processes happening with the Indigenous communities in Canada is a whole nother story. So I think it's a work in progress. I think there's a lot to be done from that perspective, and I do believe in basically as I have in the book, and I'm just making sure I get it right. So restorative justice, and they call it in Germany working off the past. So what I think is important is the first step to restorative justice is understanding how things have impacted us from a historical perspective, which is why I did my second book on the roots of racism, because it helps to understand, the deep history there and how we have, kind of been constantly in this context that impacts the way we see things like race and so on, which of course is a social construct. But in any case, I see it more from a global perspective, but I do talk about different approaches to restorative justice in the book, and I think there are many interesting practices, but it's a very much something that's in process and developing. So,
thank you very much for the question. And do we have a question, Grace or Allie, online? Yeah, could you read the question, please, Allie?
I sure will. We have a question here. It was a little bit lengthy, but I'll try to sum it up the best I can. This person is wondering, how do we bring about meaningful change in academia rather than giving people the perception that this change is occurring because of visible efforts that may be put into place more as a Band-Aid? They gave the example of task forces, websites, when these visible initiatives may not be enacting true change at a level at the university.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's one of the reasons I went to McGill, because they're actually doing what they said they would do. I think what happened in kind of the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and the protests of the summer of 2020 is that there were a lot of companies putting out statements, and I think part of the issue is we're a little lost when it comes to actually what to do, or it's hard, especially in academia. It can be, as I know from my own experience, it can be very difficult to create change, and even to create acceptance around like I'm very hard on my own discipline of political science, the impact of history, right? And so one of the things that I think is important is in academia in particular is you have to have, I talk about inclusive leadership, but it has to be top down and bottom up. So, and we have that going on. We have students who are making demands and who are stepping up and saying, look, we want to see change. And, we are seeing, for example, the strategy we're pursuing at McGill came from we have a principal, same as a president, and the provost office. And, it was their idea to have me be involved in implementing that strategy, given my experience and so on. And so, and then there's also something called the Scarborough Charter that's been developed with many institutions across Canada that tries to address these issues. But part of it is, trying to get buy-in from both the top and the bottom and in between. It's trying to get engagement across a campus. And it's not easy, believe me. Working across silos on a college campus, especially the big ones, it takes a lot of work. And I can tell you, I foresee that, I'm probably going to be spending the next 5-6 years at least just trying to, not just to hire the faculty and bring in the students, but to change the culture, to get people to see the value. And that's the important thing, is if you say that you're giving value to these efforts, that's much more impactful than just making the statement. And so giving value is giving resources. It's actually coming up with plans that you implement, and also valuing the people who are on the ground doing the work. And that's one thing I'm going to be working on a lot in the next year or two. And also, retention efforts of both staff and faculty and students across the board. So.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the online question. And thank you, Dr. Givens. And so what I'd like to do now is, first of all, acknowledge Dr. Givens for both her keynote presentation and the dialogue with the students online. Thank you. And now we go to the table level discussion. The discussion guidelines are on the question and the discussion questions. So the facilitators, we huddled before. I'm going to ask everybody to introduce yourselves and then respond to Dr. Givens's work on a number of different ways for about 20 minutes. Dr. Givens will circulate, I'll circulate, give a 5-minute warning, then we'll come back together. So thank you so much and enjoy. Thank you.